Found Duckling by EvaDragon, Chapter 19. Gotta love trauma dumping. Summary. Danny and Co. finally get to celebrate his B-Day, but the universe decides to fuck with him instead. Danny, Jazz, Sam, and Tucker also decide that the Bat Clan need to hear about more of their Amity Park trauma. Danny slowly opened his eyes to the realization that he was warm and in what could only be described as a cuddle pile. His core let out a series of happy trills before settling on his usual contented purr. Several sleepy and happy snorts greeted his purr, letting him know that he was indeed surrounded by his frayed. The purr of his core got louder. Danny hadn't remembered being pulled into a cuddle pile. In fact, the last thing he remembered was Tim being in trouble on his birthday/death day and going full eldritch horror to rescue him. How long ago had that been? "Hey, you're awake," Tim said as he rubbed his eyes and sat up. There were several grumbles around them as he did so. "Yeah, how long was I out?" Danny asked, also rubbing his sleep-crusted eyes. "A little over 2 days," Bruce replied, walking into the room that housed the impromptu cuddle pile. Bruce did a quick head check to make sure that everyone was accounted for, and then he nodded to himself. Dick, Jason, Jazz, and Cass were on the outside of the pile acting like perimeter guards. Babs, Steph, Damien, and Duke made up the middle circle, while Sam, Tucker, Danny, and Danny completed the inner circle. Jazz had been flown out on an emergency case for a few days while Danny recovered. She was doing well enough in her classes that she could afford to miss a few days. Last night's patrol had gone smoothly, but Danny, for some reason, had been exceptionally clingy, so it had been decided that he needed a cuddle pile. Jazz speculated that it was because Danny had been forced to transform into Phantom on his death day, and something had happened to Tim that made Danny so clingy. Which, fair. The Bat Fam was still learning about all things ghost-related, but that also meant that Danny himself was still learning about all things ghost-related. "How are you feeling, chum?" Bruce asked Danny as he shifted intangibly through the pile and floated up towards him. "If I'm being honest, like I could eat a house and then sleep another week," Danny replied with a fanged grin. "Man, that does sound good. I wish..." Dick was suddenly cut off as 3 people suddenly jumped on him, and he found no less than 4 hands on his mouth. The rest of the Bat Clan looked on his stupefied horror as Jazz, Sam, and Tucker unwound themselves from where they'd launched themselves at Dick. "What the fuck was that?" Jason asked in exasperated awe. "Language, Master Jason," Alfred chided as he walked in. "Breakfast is ready in the dining room." Alfred then turned and disappeared back the way he came from. At the mention of food, everyone perked up, and then the race was on to see who could get to the table first. Once they were sat in their favorite chairs and had food in front of their faces, Jason repeated his question. "So what was that with Dickwad when you stopped him from saying, 'I wish'?" The Amity Parkers, except for Danny, all exchanged glances, communicating silently before Danny took a gulp of his coffee and sighing. "Okay, so some backstory is necessary for this one. You know how the genie in Aladdin grants wishes, right?" Everyone at the table nods. And say someone says, "I wish," and then suddenly there's like a million deer running around. If someone wished for $1,000,000 or something, right? Again, everyone nods. But the genie in Aladdin has rules and restrictions. They can only grant 3 wishes: no wishing for unlimited wishes, no killing anyone, no bringing anyone back from the dead, and no making anyone fall in love. Another nod accompanied this to indicate that everyone still understood. But there is a ghost genie, Desiree. Because she's a ghost, she's not bound by those rules. She'll twist your wishes to suit her power. But also granting wishes is what gives her her powers. We've had to fight her a few times. You can imagine we're just a little paranoid about anyone saying the words, "I wish." For example, a girl back in Amity, in fact, she was at Nasty Burger that day we went back, the Latina girl, Paulina. She wished that she could be cute and popular. Desiree turned her into basically a walking, talking, anime-like girl doll thing that looked like Paulina. Granted, the doll was very cute and popular, but at the end of the day, it was a doll and not a living, breathing girl. What the fuck? Jason gaped at Danny. Oh yeah, she once turned Dash into a monster because he wished he could crush the opposing football team, Sam continued. Both Sam and I have also had our wishes turned against us. It wasn't pretty, Tucker said softly. Someone, probably Dick, whistled softly in the background. Bruce looked like someone had just revived and killed Ace, the bat dog, again. And I'm fairly certain that most of my rogues were contained in the Infinite Realms when I destroyed all of the man-made portals, but there's always a chance that one of them could have found a natural portal. And Wolf and Cujo can both create portals, which means that there's always a possibility that one of them could have escaped, either by forcing Wolf or Cujo, or by slipping through when Cujo sought me out, Danny further explained. So you've never uttered "I wish"? Tim asked. Not since Desiree, and she was like the 6th ghost I fought, and I was still getting the hang of my powers. My ghost sense would only warn us that a ghost was nearby, just not which one. Danny sounded done with the whole thing. Not that any of the Waynes could blame him. For once, Dick was speechless. Bruce pinched his nose. For all that he was glad that Danny was in their lives, sometimes he wished that Danny could keep his mouth shut. Just once. Bruce had realized that where Danny was concerned, for the first time in forever, he did not need to know. And wasn't that a scary thing to realize? Tim had confided in Bruce that he felt much the same way. The family congregated in the familiar sitting room and began playing rounds of Mario Kart. Bruce kept a careful watch on the clock before he called a stop to their tournament. Everyone grumbled at being interrupted, but the Waynes quickly quieted their mouth when they realized why Bruce had stopped them. They had never really gotten to celebrate Danny's birthday, so Bruce had rented out the observatory for them. The weather forecast had stated that the night was supposed to be one of the rare clear nights, and there was a meteor shower due, so it was actually, hopefully, a surprise for Danny. The entire family piled into the vehicle that Bruce had been forced to buy. It was one of those 15-seater vans, and of course, like everything else that Bruce did, this van had been specially designed and was considered top of the line for its class and model. And of course, like all of the Wayne vehicles, it was in a sleek black so that it wouldn't easily stand out in Gotham. But this van had also been designed so that Babs could fit her wheelchair in, if she ever rode with them. The ride to the observatory was all mild threats and absolute chaos. Bruce pinched the bridge of his nose, hoping to prevent the building headache he could sense. Alfred looked over at him from the driver's seat and gave him a quiet snort. It wasn't dignified by any means, but Bruce got the message even so. Bruce had asked for this. Maybe not in so many words, but in his proclivity in always taking in Strays, as Damien was prone to remind him. Bruce's family had grown beyond his imagination. He wouldn't change a thing, though. Alfred pulled the van up in front of the observatory, and then the infighting began for who would be the first out of the van. Danny and Danny won by simply phasing out. They stood beside the van, waiting for the rest of the family to realize that they'd lost. It was utter chaos as Dick realized that the twins had used their powers to escape. "That is no fair," Dick whined. Danny and Danny gave him grins that were just a little too wide and held a few too many teeth, because they were nothing if not chaos incarnate. Dick simply facepalmed because he'd walked right into that, and he knew it. Danny's eyes sparkled with unfettered joy. He launched onto Bruce and began pulling the man towards the entrance. If he used a bit of his super strength, Bruce merely laughed at him. You could feel his son literally vibrating in his excitement. It was a surprise that Danny hadn't started floating just yet, and both Tim and Tucker were close by, just in case. Danny pulled Bruce and Tim to the exhibits while also info dumping about each of them. He was so knowledgeable that they had gained an audience. Somehow Danny had become an informal guide to the rest of the Bat Clan. They didn't even need the guide that Bruce had hired. Bruce quietly waved the young man away with a smile, but made a mental note to still give the man a hefty tip. Danny was positively beaming as they made their way to the theater. Danny was so far gone in his space obsession that he didn't even hear the snickers of his family. But they were about to watch the movie The Myths of Ancient Stars, and frankly, Danny couldn't have been happier. And of course, that's when the universe decided that's when it needed to fuck with Danny. The screen began playing nothing but snowy static, and then Danny's ghost sense went off. Suddenly, a loud ripping sound went through the theater, and then there were no less than half a dozen observants crowding into the space. The Bat Clan all tensed, seeing the observants for the first time. Danny had described them once, but seeing them in person was a sight, to behold. They were green-skinned and a single floating eyeball. They wore a high white robe that was trimmed in gold with a high-collared black cape. The Bat Clan got the impression that they were sneering even though they didn't have mouths or any other identifying facial features to sneer with. Danny immediately floated up and transformed into his kingly phantom form. The crown of ice floated above his white hair, and the ring of peace encircled his right index finger. He snarled at them. It was feral. It promised pain. It promised to bring their nightmares to life. It surprisingly soothed the hearts of the Bat Clan.
"What are you floating fuckers doing here?"
Phantom growled. The observant that was closest to Danny sneered even more, if that was possible. "Prince Phantom, we have come because according to..."
"No!"
The observant stared at Phantom. "I must stop you right there, eyes sly. Nope, not happening. There is a council established to handle any issues until I'm of age. The realms ruled themselves for over 2 millennia, while Pariah Dark was locked in his sarcophagus. You are not going to start shit now, just because there's suddenly a king, prince, whatever the fuck you want to call me, who's accessible just to do your dirty work.
I will not be your puppet or bitch."
The last sentence had come out staticky and somewhat garbled as Danny slipped into ghost speak. The observants all flinched.
Fright Night.
If it were possible for ghosts to pale, the observants achieved it. For the second time, the Bat Clan got to see the Knight of the King. "My liege?" he asked. "It seems as though several pests have interrupted my birthday celebration with my frayed." Phantom sounded bored, as if he were explaining literal dog shit to someone. The Black Knight looked around to where Phantom had pointed to see the observants cowering in a corner. "Indeed, Pandora will be most displeased with this development," Fright Night replied in the same tone. Phantom nodded. "See that they are returned to where they belong, and inform my council. I was
Guaranteed
another 98 years before having to deal with this. If it were truly important, CW would have sent word." "As you command." Fright Night pulled out his sword, Soul Shredder, and in one beautifully frightening arc, pulled all 6 of the observants into a nightmare realm. "I shall release them once I am in front of your council, so that they may face their punishment." His voice had dropped from the static into more normal tones. Phantom nodded, and Fright Night blinked out of existence. Phantom took another look around to make sure that the threat had passed before transforming back into Danny. Once Danny was human again, the movie resumed playing on the projector screen. "So, we're just gonna ignore all of that?" Jason snarked. Danny merely sighed. How was he going to explain that? He didn't even know. He heaved another sigh. His eyes strayed to the screen where the credits were now rolling past. "Can we just wait till we get home? It's my birthday celebration, after all," Danny whined. It was Bruce's turn to sigh. As much as he wanted information, Danny had a point. But this also wound back to what he was thinking earlier. In that, where Danny was concerned, he didn't necessarily want to know more. Because knowing more meant more trauma for everyone involved. "It can wait. We still have to visit the gift shop," Bruce said after having made his decision. Danny sent him a look full of gratitude. They meandered in the gift shop for another 45 minutes before everyone had their chosen gifts. Dick found a new coffee cup. Jason found a new Wonder Woman hoodie. Tim bought a new game that looked interesting. Damien got some art supplies. Duke found a pair of space-themed sunglasses. Cass got herself a green alien figurine in a tutu. Steph found glitter slime. Babs found the perfect headset. Jazz picked up a new psychology book. Sam was interested in a Gotham-themed tarot card set. Tucker picked up what could only be described as a psychedelic keyboard. Danny picked up one of the miniature wind tunnel machines. And Danny got 2 different star projectors, 3 new models of various rocket ships that he would have to build and paint, several more packets of glow-in-the-dark stars for his ceiling, 3 space posters, a space-themed hoodie that said, "I need more space" across the front, and 2 little ghost plushies. Danny said the ghost plushies looked like blob ghosts. The other Amity Parkers cackled because he was right. Once more, they piled back into the van that would take them back to Wayne Manor. Danny remained steadfastly silent, determined that his family would not be able to interrogate him until they reached home. They tried. Oh, how they tried. They were the bats and birds, fucking damn it. But Danny was the Ghost King. He could outstubborn them all just out of pure spite. He hadn't defeated what amounted to gods and prevented world-ending threats, basically on his own to feel threatened by mere mortals. Jazz, Sam, Tucker, and Danny were never wishing, but something along those lines, that they had popcorn for the show. As soon as the van pulled into the garage, Danny phased out of the van and flew up to his room. He knew that he couldn't avoid his family forever, but he at least wanted a few minutes to organize his thoughts. "Danny, you can't hide in there forever," Tim scolded as he knocked on Danny's door. "Wasn't hiding in here forever," Danny pouted as he opened the door. Tim flicked his brother on the forehead. Sure. Come on. Everyone's waiting for us." "Fuck. Okay." Danny heaved a sigh and then realized he'd done a lot of that in the last couple of hours. Danny linked his arm into Tim's and let Tim lead him into the correct room. He took his usual seat between his favorite brothers. He looked around at each of his frayed. "Are you sure you really want to know?" "Danny, nothing you say will scare us away from you," Dick said with conviction. "Danny, you've already proven that everything you say is traumatizing to some degree. This is just another exercise of that," Damien said with a slight sneer. Danny exchanged a look with Sam, Tucker, and Jazz. Even they didn't know the whole story. Last year, our school administered a thing called the Career Aptitude Test, or CAT. I was super stressed between my already failing classes and the ghost fights, and it was just a really bad time. Just before the test, I came across the answers to it, and yes, I cheated on it. My teacher, Mr. Lancer, caught me and called the Fentons to meet him at the Nasty Burger. Jazz, Sam, and Tucker were there too. We've already explained how nasty sauce can combust. On that day, it happened. It took out Nasty Burger, killing everyone inside, including everyone I just mentioned. The only reason I survived was because of my ghost staff. "Danny, that never happened." Jazz looked at her younger brother in confusion. "I'm not done, Jazz. Let me explain." Jazz nodded, her eyebrows scrunched in thought. In my grief, I fled to Vlad, figuring that he would understand since he was a half like me, but I was consumed by my grief. Eventually, I asked Vlad to separate Fenton and Phantom using the ghost gauntlets. The four Amity Parkers gasped in shock. Tim and Jason looked at Danny in horror. The rest of the family were stupefied. Phantom immediately turned on Vlad and used the gauntlets to separate Vlad and Plasmius. Phantom and Plasmius merged, becoming a new being called Dark Danny or Dark Phantom. Dan killed Danny, but left Vlad alive. For the next 10 years, Dan rampaged and killed pretty much the whole world. Then Clockwork found me in present day before I had cheated. CW sent me to the future to try and beat Dan. Got my ass handed to me. Then Dan trapped me in the future and took my place in the past to try and make the Nasty Burger explosion happen to ensure he would be created. I managed to get back to the past and then kicked his ass, trapping him in the Fenton thermos. But doing this meant that Dan was now outside of the time stream. "What does this have to do with what happened in the observatory?" Tim asked. The floating eyeballs, officially the observance, unlike CW, who can see all possible timelines in every dimension, the observance can only see one timeline at a time. So they saw the timeline where Dan got created, got spooked, and then sent CW to kill me. When that didn't happen, and then when I won the title of Ghost King by right of conquest, well, it means that they hate me, but also that I have more power/authority than them. They hate me because they fear that I might one day turn into Dan, but also because I'm not a full ghost, and also because I'm still an infant ghost-wise, and also because I have more power than them. But at the same time, I am their king. It's honestly kind of fucked. They don't want me to be king, but at the same time, they want me to the job. Damn, Danny, Jason breathed out. Yeah, fortunately, my council agreed to give me the rest of my human lifetime or until I become a full ghost before I take up the full mantle of Ghost King. The observants just like to pretend they have the power to push. Can we ask who all is on your council? Bruce asked. He was regretting even pushing as much as he had. Pandora, the ancient of ancient Greece. She's also my combat instructor. Frostbite, chief of the Far Frozen, and my personal physician. Nocturne, the ancient of sleeping and dreams. Vortex, the ancient of weather and storms. Dorothea, the ancient of medieval Europe. Undergrowth was part of my council, but after what he pulled a few weeks ago, he's been suspended. And Clockwork. Danny, haven't you fought most of these? Tim's voice rose several pitches by the time he was done. Yeah, I only fought Dorothea because she was under the spell of her amulet, but the other ancients I've fought and won against, earned their respect. Doesn't mean that they're bad advisors. I've never fought against Pandora or Frostbite. Actually helped both of them. And Clockwork may be a cryptic bastard, but he's been my Alfred since I became a Hatha. Everyone in the room was silent. No one quite knew how to respond to the trauma dumpster fire that was Danny's life. While Jazz, Sam, and Tucker had always suspected something had happened, they had never gotten the whole story. And of course, the bats were still new to the whole ghost thing. Maybe one day they would learn to stop asking Danny about his life before. Maybe. That was still up for debate. They slowly dispersed to their respective rooms. Danny had given them much to think about and even more trauma. Tim followed Danny to his room. Danny, I just wanted to let you know that you're not the only one who has fought an evil future version of themselves. What? What? Danny whisper shouted. Tim moved them both to the bed. Yeah, I did too. I became Batman in the future. He told me that he did some things that Batman would never do. I fought him, and I won. So you're not as alone as you think. Danny leaned against his brother, completely drained and exhausted. Thank you, Danny whispered, and then proceeded to pull Tim down for snuggles. Tim squawked in surprise and then gave into Danny's need to be comforted. He set an alarm so that they could get up to get ready for patrol, and then they were both asleep. Notes. Dick. I wish. Amity Parkers. Oh, hell no. Batclan. What the fuck? Amity Parkers. Trauma dumps about Desiree. Batclan. Again. What the fuck? Bruce. Takes them to the observatory. Danny. Space. Stars. Space. Batclan. Bruce, what have you done? What fresh hell is this? Observants appear. Danny. Oh, fuck that shit. Batclan begins reaching for their anti-ghost weapons. Danny. Fright Night, take out the trash. Fright Night with pleasure. Batclan. Danny, what the fuck? Danny trauma dumps about Dan and the observants. Batclan sucking thumbs and crying, curled up in the fetal position in the corner. Danny. What? You asked?